All right, so we're back and ready to really dive deep into this study guide. We're going to be focusing on pages 165 to 176 today. This is all about the nitty-gritty of conducting examinations.
You got it, and it's a crucial section. We're talking foundational knowledge here.
Yeah, definitely. So we're going to try to hit every single definition, at least touch on it. We don't need to explain every single one in detail, but we do need to make sure that we repeat them. Repetition, repetition, repetition. That's the key here.
Absolutely. It's all about reinforcement, making these terms second nature.
Exactly. So let's jump right in. First up, Section 10B of the FDI Act. What's the gist of this one?
Okay, so Section 10B of the FDI Act, it's pretty straightforward. It grants examiners the power to thoroughly examine any bank. And then after that, it requires a full and detailed report.
So it's like, here's the authority to look, and now tell us everything you found.
Exactly. Power to examine and the requirement for a detailed report. Those are the key takeaways.
Got it. Makes sense. Now, while an examination is actually going on, what's the communication like? I mean, is it kind of a one-way street, or is there a lot of back and forth?
No, it's definitely not a one-way street. Ongoing communication, constant communication, that is absolutely crucial. We're talking between the examiners, the field management, the regional office, everybody's got to be talking. And of course, the bank management too.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess before the examiners even set foot in the bank for the on-site exam, there's a lot of prep work and communication that needs to happen, right?
Oh, absolutely. Coordination beforehand is key. So the examiner in charge, we call them the EIC, they need to get in touch with the bank management, work out all the logistics.
Makes sense, like scheduling, space.
Exactly. Information requests, what they're going to need from the bank, figuring out workspace, where the examiner is going to be set up, and also the general scope of the exam. What areas are they going to be focusing on?
So it's all about setting clear expectations from the get-go.
Exactly. Get everybody on the same page right from the start.
Now, I know that sometimes we have to deal with banks that aren't exactly in tip-top shape.
Right.
So when we're talking about those banks, those that have been rated Camel's Composite 3 or worse, how does the FDIC actually convey its expectations to the bank's management?
Yeah, that's important. So in those situations, the FDIC's expectations, those need to be crystal clear. And they need to be communicated clearly, ideally, between the close of the exam and before any enforcement action is taken.
So there's that window.
Yeah. And usually financial services, they'll send what we call an examination letter to the CEO or the president. This letter kind of spells everything out. Now, sometimes, if the bank has just been newly rated Composite 3 or worse, they might actually get that letter even earlier, maybe at the exit meeting.
Interesting. So it's all about being very direct and timely with that communication.
Absolutely. Transparency is key in those situations.
Okay. Let's move on to supervisory recommendations. Now, this is about what the FDIC expects the bank to actually do to address any problems, right?
You got it. Supervisory recommendations, those are basically the FDIC saying, here's what we think you need to do to improve. And they're serious business. These aren't just suggestions. These are real expectations for the bank.
So is that always done formally? I mean, in a meeting, or is it a written thing?
It's all about clarity here. So these concerns, these meaningful concerns, they are always communicated in writing. And the whole idea of corrective action, what the bank needs to do to fix things, that should always be thoroughly discussed.
So it's not just, hey, here's a list of problems, good luck.
Right. Exactly. It's a collaborative process, but the FDIC's expectations are definitely spelled out very clearly.
Got it. Now, at the very end of the examination report, we've got the last ECC comment. Can you remind us, what's the main point of that final comment?
Yeah, so the final ECC comment, that's really there to remind the board, the bank's board of directors, that they have a responsibility. They got to read the entire report, the whole thing, and then sign it.
So it's like, we've done our part, now you acknowledge it.
Exactly. And of course, it includes the signatures of everyone involved, the examiner, the reviewing official, everybody signs off with their title. So it's a formal record of completion.
Okay, let's talk enforcement actions. So when a bank's been hit with one of these, either formal or informal, what's the bottom line, the most basic expectation the FDIC has?
It's all about accountability. The bank has to demonstrate that they're actually complying with these enforcement actions, whether it's formal administrative actions or those PCA directives, they got to show they're following through.
And those PCA directives, those are the prompt corrective action directives, right?
That's right.
Okay, so let's say during an examination, the examiners discover a violation. Is there a specific way that those violations have to be documented?
Oh, yeah. There's definitely a standard format, a very specific format for reporting these violations.
So nothing's left to chance.
Right, it has to be clear and consistent. So what you'll see in the report is, you'll see a heading, first of all. Then the citation, the actual regulation that was violated. Then a description of the violation, and that's got to be pretty specific.
So not just they messed up.
No, it's got to be detailed. Then you have the management response, how they explain the violation. And finally, if it's necessary, you'll have the director approval, depending on the situation.
I see. So what happens if there are just tons of violations, like a huge number of really technical minor violations? I mean, do you list every single one in the main report?
Well, sometimes you get those situations where there are just a ton of these very technical violations. They're not huge, but they're still violations. So in those cases, what we'll do in the report of examination is provide a sample list. We'll just list a few examples.
Do you give a sense of what's going on?
Exactly. But the bank management, they get a full list. They need to know about every single one. And of course, a copy of that full list goes into the work papers.
Makes sense. Now, what happens if the examiners find something, some practice that's, well, it's not a clear-cut violation, but it's still a bit iffy, something that's raising some eyebrows?
Yeah.
How do they flag that for further attention?
Right. So sometimes you see something and it's just not quite right. Doesn't meet the threshold for a formal violation, but it's still questionable. In those situations, the examiner prepares a separate memo. This goes to the regional director. And in that memo, each specific practice, whether it's undesirable, objectionable, each one is detailed. And this is for practices that are considered unsafe or unsound.
So it's a way to shine a light on those practices without necessarily bringing down the hammer.
Exactly. It's a way to say, hey, this is worth a closer look, could be a problem down the road.
Got it. Now, what if an examination reveals something really serious, something that could actually lead to charges being filed against the bank? What's the protocol in that situation?
Yeah, that's a whole different ballgame. So if we're talking about information that could lead to those Section 8 charges, well, in those cases, the regional office, they have to be consulted before that report is submitted. It's crucial.
Okay. And what about the language in the report itself? I mean, can the examiners just come right out and say unsafe and unsound?
That's a good point. They actually can't. Even if the examiners think those practices are unsafe and unsound, they can't use those terms in the ROE itself. Those findings have to be presented in the ECC, but not the body of the report. Because, ultimately it's the FDIC board who has the authority to make that determination.
So you have to be careful about how you frame it.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's dig a little deeper into this undesirable and objectionable practices memo. What kind of information typically goes into that?
Okay, so in this memo, first of all, it references each specific action, and each one has its own subheading. And there are references back to the recent report.
To connect the dots.
Right. Then each violation is discussed separately. And here's something important. The memo includes statements, actual statements from the bank's directors and officers.
So they get to have their say.
Exactly. And those statements, they could include things like statements that actually support the charges or maybe descriptions of any corrective actions they've already taken. And finally, the memo has recommendations.
From the examiner.
Right. Recommendations about specific actions the bank should take, recommendations about the management situation as a whole. And if there are individuals who might be named in a formal action, their names and addresses are included in the memo. It's really a comprehensive document laying the groundwork for potential action.
So it's kind of a blueprint.
In a way, yeah.
Now, if we're dealing with less formal enforcement actions, is there a different tool that examiners typically use?
Yeah, so for informal actions, we often use what's called a call-in sheet. It's a bit less heavy-handed.
Less paperwork.
Right. It's more straightforward. Basically, it lists the facts upon which the conclusion is based, and these are discussed in order of importance. And each fact gets its own subheading. It's a nice, organized way to lay things out.
Okay, so sadly, sometimes examinations reveal potential criminal activity. How do examiners handle that in their reports?
Well, this is a sensitive area, obviously. So when we're talking about criminal violations, first of all, we always describe them as apparent.
Not definite criminal activity.
Exactly. And that's because there's always the possibility of administrative review or even judicial review. We're not the judge and jury. And it's really important that examiners don't speculate. So no opinions on whether someone will actually be indicted or convicted. We just stick to the facts.
I see. Just report what you find.
Right. But we do need to be as specific as possible. So we'll identify who reported the issue, how the violation happened, that kind of detail.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about violations and enforcement actions, but let's step back and talk about conditions. specific conditions at a bank that could be red flags. What are some examples of things that examiners would consider unsafe or unsound?
Okay, so unsafe or unsound conditions, these are basically practices or situations that, if they continue, they're going to pose an abnormal risk of loss or damage. And that could be to the bank itself or to the DIF.
The GIF, that's the Deposit Insurance Fund.
Right. So there are a lot of examples, but some of the most common ones include things like maintaining a really low net interest margin, having excessive overhead expenses, having a huge volume of loans that are classified as substandard or worse, excessive net loan losses, excessive overdue loans, tons of non-earning assets. You get the picture.
Yeah, it's all about things that are out of whack.
Exactly. And it also includes things like paying excessive dividends, when the bank really can't afford it, or committing violations of law, not providing adequate supervision over the bank's officers, not having an adequate allowance for loan and lease losses.
So these are all signs of a bank that's in trouble.
Potentially, yeah. And we also look at things like failure to post the general ledger on time, failure to keep accurate records, not accounting for transactions properly, not enforcing loan repayment programs. I mean, the list goes on.
That's all about the fundamentals.
Yeah. And we also look at things like whether the bank is failing to maintain proof of lien priority on loans that are secured by real estate.
Yeah.
Whether they're failing to oversee compliance with laws and regulations, whether they're engaging in risky lending practices, operating without enough liquidity. So many things.
It's a lot for examiners to keep an eye on.
It is. And we haven't even mentioned things like relying too much on volatile deposits or not having adequate internal controls or even engaging in speculative investment policies. All of these things can be red flags.
Got it. So it's a pretty comprehensive list. Now, what about capital? Specifically, when would a bank with less than the minimum required capital automatically be considered unsafe and unsound?
Okay, so the rule is that any bank that's operating with less than the minimum capital levels, they're automatically considered unsafe and unsound. Unless they've entered into a written agreement with the FDIC.
Ah, okay.
And this agreement has to spell out how they're going to improve. So they have to agree to increase their Tier 1 leverage ratio to an acceptable level. And they have to agree to take whatever other actions are necessary to address the problems.
So the agreement is the key.
Exactly. If they're not working with the FDIC to fix things, then they're considered unsafe and unsound.
Makes sense. Now, let's talk a little bit about PCA and capital directives. These are terms that we hear tossed around a lot. Can you quickly explain the difference between these two regulatory tools?
Sure. So PCA, that stands for Prompt Corrective Action. And it's basically a framework that gives regulators a lot of options, a lot of tools that they can use to address problems at a bank. It's pretty broad.
Okay.
So they could require the bank to recapitalize, or they could restrict the bank's activities. It really depends on the situation.
So it's the full toolbox.
Yeah, it's got it all. Now, a capital directive, that's more focused. It's mainly about recapitalization. So if a bank gets hit with a capital directive, the main thing they're going to have to do is increase their capital levels. And they'll usually have to submit a capital restoration plan, a CRP, that shows how they're going to do it.
Got it. So PCA is broader, and capital directives are more specifically about shoring up capital.
You got it.
Now, what happens when regulators identify problems at a bank, but they don't yet warrant a formal enforcement action? What tools are available to them in those situations?
Well, in those cases, they can turn to what we call informal enforcement actions. These are actions that are designed to help a bank correct problems without having to resort to those more formal legal orders.
So it's a way to nudge them in the right direction.
Exactly. And there are a lot of different types of informal enforcement actions. For example, they could use commitment letters, where the bank agrees to take specific actions. Or they could use board resolutions, where the bank's board of directors formally acknowledges the problem and commits to fixing it. Or they could use memoranda of understanding, those MOUs that we talked about earlier.
Right.
They could also use letter agreements or other forms of bilateral or unilateral actions. There are a lot of options.
Okay, so it's a whole spectrum.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about those situations where violations require more than just corrective action. Let's talk about those civil money penalties. What triggers those, and what are they all about?
Okay, so civil money penalties, those CMPs, they can be assessed for a whole bunch of things. It could be violations of laws or regulations, violations of final orders or temporary orders, violations of written conditions that are attached to applications, or violations of written agreements. So basically, if you break the rules, you could be hit with a CMP.
And these CMPs, they're really about punishment, right?
Yeah, that's part of it. They're meant to punish the wrongdoer. but they're also meant to deter future violations.
So hit them where it hurts.
Well, yeah, in a way. And these CMPs, they come in 3 tiers. So the amount of the penalty depends on how serious the violation is and what kind of impact it had.
Okay, so let's talk about those things that aren't actually on a bank's balance sheet. Specifically, contingent liabilities. What are those and how are they broken down for examination purposes?
Okay, so contingent liabilities, those are interesting. Basically, a contingent liability is a liability that might happen, but it depends on something else happening first. So it's a potential liability, but it's not an actual liability yet.
Got it.
Now, there are 2 main categories of contingent liabilities. Category I, those are liabilities that if they actually do become real liabilities, they'll also result in an increase in the bank's assets.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. A loan commitment is a good example. So the bank has committed to making this loan, but they haven't actually funded it yet. If the borrower decides to take the loan, then the bank has to fund it. So that's a contingent liability. But if the loan is funded, the bank's assets will go up because they now have this loan on their books.
Okay, I see. So what about category 2?
Category 2 contingent liabilities, those are different. If they become real liabilities, it'll be a claim on the bank's assets, but there won't be a corresponding increase in assets.
So the bank will lose something, but they won't gain anything.
Exactly. A common example is pending litigation. Let's say the bank is being sued. That's a contingent liability. If they lose the lawsuit, they're going to have to pay out money, which will reduce their assets.
Makes sense. So how do contingent liabilities affect a bank's capital calculations?
Okay, so for Category I contingent liabilities, if they're classified as loss, and for Category 2 contingent liabilities, if they're classified as estimated loss, then those amounts are deducted from the bank's Common Equity Tier 1 capital.
Okay. And what about their average total assets?
Neither category is deducted from average total assets. It's just from the CET1 capital.
Okay, got it. Now, earlier we talked about apparent criminal violations. What happens if the bank suffers losses as a result of these violations? How does that affect their capital?
That's a good question. So if a bank has material losses that can't be covered by a specific asset classification, then those losses have to be deducted from their CET1 capital.
So those losses have a direct impact on their capital.
They do.
Okay, one last thing. Can you give us a quick overview of those safety and soundness composite ratings?
Sure. So these composite ratings, they range from 1 to 5. A rating of 1 means the bank is sound in every way. They might have a few minor weaknesses, but they're easily handled. And they've got strong performance and risk management.
So they're the gold standard.
Pretty much. Now, a rating of 2, that means the bank is fundamentally sound. They might have some moderate weaknesses, but management should be able to correct those. And they've got satisfactory risk management.
So they're okay, but there's room for improvement.
Exactly. Now, a rating of 3, that's where things start to get a little more serious. A 3 rating means that the bank generally has unsafe or unsound practices or conditions.
So they're in trouble.
Yeah, it means there are serious financial or managerial deficiencies, and the bank needs close supervisory attention. A 3-rated bank is a risk to the DIF.
And it's possible they might fail.
Right. And then we have a rating of 4. 4 means that the bank has extremely unsafe or unsound practices and conditions. They're really deficient in a lot of areas.
These are the ones that are really on the brink.
Yeah, they need immediate assistance, and there's a very real chance that they could fail.
And a 5.
A 5 is the worst. It means the bank is critically deficient, their performance is terrible, their risk management is inadequate, they need immediate help just to stay afloat. And unfortunately, failure is very likely in those cases.
Okay, that's a sobering thought.
It is.
Well, this has been a really helpful deep dive into those key pages of the study guide. We've covered a lot of ground, from specific definitions to broader concepts.
We have.
And I think it's clear that understanding these examination concepts is essential, not just for those who work in the industry, but also for anyone who wants to really understand how banks are regulated and supervised.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up, I'd like to leave our listeners with this thought. We've talked about all the different things that examiners look for, all the potential red flags. But what do you think is the single most important factor in ensuring that a financial institution remains safe and sound?
Ooh, good question, I'd say.
We'll let you ponder that one. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive,
My pleasure.
and we'll see you next time.
Sounds good.